Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Chairman, for introducing me. What I would like to do to start with is to thank the organizers, Professor Kim, Professor Ok, inviting us. And as usual, Professor Ok has arranged everything in detail. Perfect. Now, what I would like to do today is to give you some general idea about how we can orient our environmental research for enhancing ecological resilience. But I will pay more emphasis on the PTS, persistent toxic substances. And now to start with, a bit about myself. I was born in Hong Kong, born and brought up. And first time I went out of Hong Kong, small area, 1,064 square kilometer. First time I went to England, and then I was trying to do my MSc in ecology, Durham University. So I was on a British Council scholarship. At the airport, I was met by a beautiful young lady, a volunteer to receive me, because I was a British Council scholar, you see. And when we crossed the street, she held me tightly. I felt very good. And she said, and she said, oh, yesterday there was a student from somewhere. He have not seen any cars before. And then I said, me no see cars before. And so she held me even tighter. Okay. So much for the joke. I have a bit more for the drinking session. How do you, I'm sorry. Getting a bit
forward then.
Oh, okay.
And point to you.
Okay. Now, the major objective, as I mentioned, I will try to show proper management of toxic chemicals is very important to ensure sustainable society. So what I would like to do is to use some case studies. I will go through them quickly, focusing on southern part of China, including Hong Kong. Now, there are three pillars of sustainability: social, environmental, and economic. And of course, environmental pillar is the most important. In terms of ecological resilience, I think it refers to an ecosystem to respond to disturbance, resisting damage, and they can recover quickly. So all these problems like natural disasters and also human activities. Now I would like to focus a bit more on human activities, on pollution. When you look back to the history, starting from 1930s, 1940s, in terms of environmental monitoring for water pollution, we tend to focus a bit more on bacteria, because all these bacteria, they will end up with a lot of diseases, and then eventually sediment. And for water pollution, we then paid a bit more emphasis on BOD, on nutrients in the early 70s, like nitrogen and phosphate, which will cause eutrophication, and then we measure chlorophyll A, and not until late 70s and early 80s, we started to look at heavy metals, all these toxic metals. And then eventually, persistent organic pollutants like pesticides, DDT and so on, endocrine disruptors, and then emerging chemicals of concern, 2010 and onwards. Now, all these chemicals, they are, we then eventually find out a lot of these chemicals are supposed to be safe at the beginning, and then eventually we found out they are not so safe. We call them emerging chemicals of concern. And then the endpoints will become smaller and smaller, and then we need to invent a new equipment in order to detect them more accurately. Now, the chairman mentioned that I took part in this regionally based assessment. It was late 1990s. We were trying to manage the launch of this exercise, and at that time the world was divided into 12 different regions, and I was lucky enough to look after the Central and Northeast Asia, and at that time we were able to look at all these toxic chemicals. Now at the beginning we focused a bit more on persistent organic pollutants, POPs, and then eventually we tried to look at other toxic chemicals which are also resistant, persistent. They are not degrading so easily. And then emerging chemicals of concern are all these chemicals, including nanoparticles, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, and so on. Now, lessons we learned from pollution. From these pollution studies, I think human beings, we are very clever. We try to make use of certain organisms which have been evolved to metal tolerance. For example, the case of heavy metals. They are terrestrial plants. They have to go through natural selection. We call them evolved tolerance. It was Professor Bradshaw, whom I worked with for about a year, and I learned quite a lot from him. And then application would be phytostabilization, phytoextraction, and then Alan Baker, who is supposed to be the world leader on hyperaccumulators and so on. So we make use of these organisms and try to remediate all these toxic sites. And then later on, we look at some wetland plants, and then we found out most of these wetland plants, they are bond tolerance. There's another term called constitutional tolerance. That means they can remediate these toxic sites without going through evolution, mostly because of the anatomical structure and other mechanisms. I don't want to go into details. For the application, it would be phytofiltration using constructed wetland, using the plant roots to filter out the pollutants. Later on, I think it would be important to use scientific scientific inputs for environmental management. This is a personal experience. Quite some time ago, 2002, I took part in an investigation on fish kills at fish culture zones because of the dredging and disposal of sediment on behalf of Civil Engineering Department. And at that time, there wasn't any EIA, so it created a lot of problems. All these fish were killed, and the government has to pay a massive sum for compensation for these fish farmers. But later on, 2013 and 2017, involved with another project which is very similar, but at this particular time we have EIA and then very stringent environmental monitoring and audit program, and then I serve as an independent reviewer for the water quality monitoring and implementation of mitigation measures. So every 3 months I will have to write a short report, review based on the data we collected from another company and try to work out whether the dredging disposal activities will create any problems to the ecosystem. Now, I would like to focus a bit more on the Pearl River Delta, southern part of China, which is the most developed region. It has a rapid economic growth, and it has become the world center for electronic products and also other industries. So at the same time, all these industries will emit a wide range of toxic chemicals. To cite an example, these are the chemicals emitted from textile industry, only textile industry. All these dyes, all these PFC, PFOA, and so on. You can imagine other industries, they will emit another batch of toxic chemicals. So recently we were talking about zero discharge of toxic industry in the Pearl River Delta. We were approached by the Hong Kong Productivity Center, and we tried to work out some time scale, but I think this would be a very slow process. So basically, the problems we have in southern part of China, including Hong Kong, would be urbanization. People are moving from village, remote area to find jobs, industrialization, emitting a lot of chemicals, and the change of land use. Now, all these lands, they supposed to be good farm soil in the past where we produce vegetables, but somehow it has been used for storage purposes, for repairing cars, and more recently, storing all this electronic waste. Now, Hong Kong still have its territory, although we have joined China 1997. When you go through from Hong Kong to China, there's still a checkpoint. You have to present your Hong Kong ID card, and then I have a mainland ID card, and then you go through. So in the past, because Hong Kong has been a free port, so all the ships are coming, and a lot of illegal shipments, electronic waste, but now the border is getting tighter. So all these electronic waste are now in our own backyard. Now, what happened? All these toxic chemicals emitted in a densely populated city like Hong Kong. So all these toxic chemicals, they come from different directions, from agriculture, open burning, flushing into the toilet, all these consumer products. Eventually, they end up in sewage treatment plants. Now, bearing in mind that these sewage treatment plants, when they were built, they're not intended to break down toxic chemicals. So we have a bit of problem recently. In a project, well, three projects commissioned by Drainage Services Department, we were trying to look at the removal efficiency of these PTS by different types of sewage treatment works. So we have tested a wide range of these toxic chemicals. Now, to cut the story short, the sewage treatment process, they are not so efficient removing all the toxic chemicals. And what's more important, there are certain congeners formed during the treatment process may be more toxic than their original congeners. So we may have some problems because eventually some of these sewage effluent will carry these toxic chemicals into the coastal environment, whereby there would be food chain, bioaccumulation, and biomagnification. Well, if you use sewage effluent, sewage sludge for land application, then you have other opportunities of these toxic chemicals entering into our food chain. Now, in addition to this, sometimes we will find illegal addition, toxic chemicals added into beverage and food. Cite some examples. Melamine, I'm sure you heard about this, creating a bit of problem, and also phthalate, plasticizers, which was happening, well, found out in Taiwan, actually. It's an endocrine disruptor. I think it was big news about 7-8 years ago, and then they found out these phthalate has been used as a clouding agents in drinks. So they add them inside, and then the drinks look cloudy. It looks giving you a pleasing color, sort of texture. And I'm not so sure whether this is linked with one of the lowest birth rates in Taiwan in the world. I don't know. It would be interesting to find out. Now, so food safety would be a very important problem. When we talk about food safety, it would be microbiological hazards, it would be chemical food contaminants, and then the GM food. And in my talk, I will concentrate on food contamination. So in terms of toxicity, potency, it will depend on the concentration and the types of food contaminants, and there would be short-term effects, high dosage. When we talk about mercury, it would be Minamata disease as a very classical example. But nowadays, we tend to worry about the long-term low dose, which may create cancers and histological damages. So what I'm interested is the geochemical cycles of these PTS, which may become food contaminants linking to health problems. Case study 1, this was carried out quite some time ago when we're trying to look at the tea plant, which is an aluminum and fluoride accumulator. At that time, I had a student from southern India, and we work on this. And fluorosis can be caused by drinking a large amount of this low quality tea, which is called brick tea. But this picture is a good quality brick tea, actually. So this poor quality tea, they made use of old leaves where they concentrate, they accumulate large amounts of aluminum and fluoride. So we need to understand the growth condition of these tea plants and the transfer of aluminum and fluoride from soil to plant, and then from products to tea liqueur. Now, if you know a bit more about tea plantation, they will find it, they like acidic conditions under pH 4, 4.5, and under such acidic conditions, the aluminum silicates will be dissolved easily, and then the aluminum and fluoride will be taken up, and then they will try to accumulate in the old leaves. So when they shed their leaves, perhaps this is the way to get rid of the high concentration of aluminum and fluoride. Now, usually when we have our tea, the best tea would be the flush, the bud, and then 2 or 3 leaves underneath. You pick those, and then you make good quality tea. Whereas these poor quality tea, they will make use of anything left, all leaves which contain high concentration of both aluminum and fluoride. And case study 2, arsenic and arsenicosis. I'm sure you heard about this. So in terms of exposure, we have inhalation, ingestion, including drinking and taking food, thermal contact, and then seafood contains a lot of arsenic. But fortunately, the type of arsenic in seafood will be organic arsenic. And then in remote area in China, they have a habit hanging all these vegetables inside the house above the cooking stove. But unfortunately, all these vegetables, they coated contaminants, including arsenic, and then these people tend to develop similar sort of the symptoms, arsenicosis, like people drinking a lot of water containing arsenic in certain places in the world. Now, we also add arsenic as a feeding materials. Rosazone is a kind of food additive controlling intestinal parasites and promote growth, increase feed efficiency. And also, arsenic is also added into some wooden structure. I remember Zhang Chaoshan did a nice study, and we work on this. Yes. So then later on, I took part in a project with the GIST in Guangzhou Institute of Technology, and then we worked on the problem, and we found out estimation of dietary intake. People who consume fish and who consume rice which contain high concentration of arsenic are exposed to arsenic. I have borrowed a picture from Professor Yong Guanzhu, remember? 2008, and he and his group did a nice work. And then he was one of the panel members deciding on the upper limit of arsenic in rice, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was co-chair.
Co-chair. And then it's widely used in the world because China was the first one doing this. So arsenic threat in rice is issued by FAO as a kind of warning. And then we also did something on the electronic waste recycling and public health. So we found out during open burning of electronic waste, they have emitted a wide range of toxic chemicals. And the open burning area serves as a toxic transformer, transforming certain chemicals into a more toxic form. To give you an example, they burn cable wires. They try to extract the copper inside. Now, burning these cable wires, the PVC, will act as a catalyst. Copper will act as a catalyst, so even forming more toxic chemicals, dioxin, and so on. Then we try to do a food basket analysis and work out the food items that are highly contaminated in the area, especially seafood, fish. And they estimated daily intake of flame retardant and also other toxic chemicals, and this one only show PBDE. And we found out these adults and babies, they are subject to high concentration of toxic chemicals in the area. Even the epidemiological data from a hospital pointed out the abrupt rises of 4 major diseases: digestive system, malignant tumor, cardiovascular system, respiratory system. So we have enough evidence. So we worried this open burning, this uncontrolled recycling, they are not repeated in other countries which needed the cash. And then we have a project on mercury fish contamination and human health because we worried about the long-term low dosage intake of mercury. And at that time, we received a funding from Research Grant Council in Hong Kong, and we were the leading institute to tackle the problem, looking at the mercury issue, especially focusing on the aquacultural zones. So basically, we have done a project on examining the shark fins, because shark fins are very popular, and then we found out this is a very good example of our bioaccumulation and biomagnification of mercury in top carnivores in the ecosystem. So we have a title, Shark Fins may be a symbol of wealth and fortune, because the Chinese community, you treat your guests to nice dinner with shark fins, but may be detrimental to your health. And then eventually we found out fish feeds would be the major sources of mercury, because they use trash fish and also compound feed. Very often they contain fish meal made of this trash fish. So this would be a problem. And then later on, we tried to conduct the health risk assessment, looking at all these common freshwater fish and marine fish in Hong Kong. And then eventually, we have done this analysis, hazard quotient. If the hazard quotient is higher than 1, there seems to be health problem. Lower than 1, it doesn't seem to be a problem. So for both freshwater and marine fish, mercury seems to be a problem. Later on, we worked with the Red Cross in Hong Kong were able to collect some blood samples. We're trying to correlate the toxic chemicals in the fish and also in the general public, and then we found out there seems to be very good correlation even with PBDE, flame retardant. There's a good correlation with the congeners. Later on, through the Dr. Leung, we were able to collect a lot of samples, fatty tissues from some patients with uterine leiomyomas, and then we tried to work out the seafood diet, and we found out there seems to be very good correlation with these patients who have more seafood diet, well, higher frequency of seafood consumption, tend to contain higher concentration of these toxic chemicals. I know this is not very scientific, but it does point out the likely association. I think we need to work a bit more on this. I had a student who was a medical doctor doing this work, wonderful work. Now, another study we looked at was the mercury related to fertility in Hong Kong. Through the information supplied by Dr. Leung, we were able to look at all the problems with subfertile males in Hong Kong. And Dr. Leung looked at a wide range of habits of these so-called subfertile males, and whether they had hot bath, whether they drink beer, whiskey, and also where do they live, how long they have been in Hong Kong, and then he narrowed down to two possibilities. Fish intake. If you take in more fish, you tend to have higher concentration of mercury in your hair as an indication, and also the number of two amalgams in your mouth. So mercury can be transformed to our second generation, and then more recently there seems to be more cases of autism reported in southern part of China. And we also work with another medical doctor, Dr. Goh, supposed to be the director of child health development, and then she is a woman. She received a lot of patients from different parts of China, and then eventually she divided them into two groups. One inland, Beijing inland groups, they have higher concentration of lead and arsenic, perhaps due to heavy polluted environment, compared with coastal groups like Shanghai and Hong Kong. These autistic children, they contain high concentration of mercury and cadmium, perhaps high consumption of seafood. Again, I think we need to do a bit more on this. So recently we have written up a review, environmental toxicants and autism, and we have found out this, in addition to heavy metals, there seems to be more and more reports about the problems of POPs, PBDE, and emerging chemicals of concern, including phthalates, I mentioned, and bisphenol A, all these products. In Hong Kong, we have a food safety center, and then they also done a piece of survey and a kind of warning. Dietary exposure to methyl mercury would be a health concern to 11% of women aged 20 to 49. So fish would be the most common route of exposure to mercury in general. And in addition to our own study, there are various reports about the same problem in different parts of the world. Prenatal mercury exposure and IQ, according to a study, there seems to be a good correlation, and then they made the conclusion IQ is a well-established endpoint used in cost, benefit, and economic analysis, the effects of environmental contaminants. Now, when you talk to the policy makers, I think it's important, showing that there are problems, economic, in the health aspect, there are problems in the economy, and then they will then listen to you. cancer villages in China. I'm sure you heard about this, but we don't have any. I'm very surprised. I tried to look at all these references. There are not too many. So we're still working on this. But in Hong Kong, we try to compare the data, the top 10 cancers in Hong Kong, 2014 compared to 2004. And we found out colorectal seems to be number one in terms of cancer, followed by lung, followed by breast cancer, and so on. It used to be lung cancer, but somehow I think the air seems to be a bit better in Hong Kong, and colorectal is coming number one. Perhaps it's because the food are contaminated, and the habit in eating. So birthday burdens would be an indicator about all these toxic chemicals entering to our bodies. And then more recently, it came out October 19, the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. So we ought to look at the pollution and health problem. These two pictures, the first one, number of deaths in 1 million people, all forms of pollution. The second one is related to water pollution. Now, if you look back to the history, we invented a lot of these chemicals. Some of them were doing very well, and then eventually, like DDT, it was banned, PCB was banned, and then the Basel Convention, Rotterdam Convention, Stockholm Convention, and so on. Now, these conventions are very effective. If you look at these graphs, DDT, PCB, PCDD, dioxin, there seems to be a declining trend. The contaminants in human milk, this was carried out in a group of Swedish scientists. They have done wonderful work. But in terms of flame retardant, there seems to be an abrupt rise. The concentration doubled every 5 years if you look at that graph. And that's why flame retardant has been included in the Stockholm control list. I'm aware of the time. So management of PTS, it would be a world concern. And then a few years ago, I also took part in a survey, and then we tried to provide some information to support the sound management of chemicals throughout their life cycle. And we try to look at countries, developing countries, and also countries with economy in transition, and heavy metal seems to be still number one problem, followed by PAH, and then the third one is mixture effects. So, but again, there are so many new chemicals coming in. I think we need to have a better control to construct a regional list of toxic chemicals. I don't think I have time to go through this. In Hong Kong, we also have an exercise carried out by the EPD, toxic substance monitoring in Hong Kong. And then more recently, we try to work on recycling the food waste into feeding materials to produce fish which are safe and have higher quality, and at the same time save space for our landfills. So we have received 3 fundings, and we try to work on freshwater fish as well as marine fish. And then we try to look at integrated wetlands for food production. The idea is to adopt polyculture to efficiently use natural resources. Now, for polyculture of carps, I think it has been very popular in the past because each of these species, they have very distinct feeding modes. They have their ecological niche. So all the waste materials, all the energy, nutrients could be fully utilized in such a polyculture. Grass carp, they stay on the top eating grasses. Big head, they are filter feeders. And then at the bottom might be a bit more competition. They tend to eat all sorts of organisms. So last slide. I think long-term low dosage of PTS through food intake seems to be a public concern. I think we need to have a holistic, multidisciplinary approach to demonstrate potential health effects and economic loss. So the policymakers will then listen a bit more. I think we should have more stringent control and management of these toxic chemicals. I think we should focus a bit more on the PTS, which are common in our region, for better control, because there's so many chemicals. We need to narrow down into a list. And we need to understand the geochemical cycles of these food contaminants, and of course, clean up toxic sites would be important. We activate local agriculture and aquaculture, safe quality food, and cut down footprint and carbon emission would be also very important. So I've used up half an hour. Thank you.